Lululemon, once upon a time, was the brand that cornered the women's fitness market like no other. But thanks to a string of controversies coinciding with a nefarious plan to turn the company public prematurely, Lululemon went sour and has yet to be turned back into Lululemon-ade. These are the books used as part of the research, no affiliate links, but this was my favorite. This video is also sponsored by Particle, so more on them throughout the video. The story of Lululemon really begins with a totally different company called West Beach Snowboard Limited that was founded in 1979 by Chip Wilson. You don't need to know a lot about this company, but it will come up several times in this story, including right now, because both Lululemon's name and their hero product came directly from West Beach. Chronologically, the first to be developed was a fabric named Lupron. You see, underneath the snowboarding gear that they sold through West Beach, Chip had developed a specific kind of cotton-like synthetic fabric which they used as a thermal or protective layer under clothing. They marketed it towards what he thought was the emerging 14 to 18-year-old female snowboarding market, but it flopped pretty heavily because there was no emerging 14 to 18-year-old female snowboarding market. They only sold 57 pairs globally, though in both of the two of his books that I read in research for this, he states, all 57 women who purchased them wrote to me pleading for more. Now, Wilson does write in hyperbole, so perhaps it was only 56 women who wrote their undying love for thermals to him, but it was clear that he had a good idea. It stuck in the back of his mind, like the fact that I attended the Copernicus Disneyland show, which I hope sticks in the back of your mind. Yes, it stuck in the back of his mind as he sold the company in 1997 for 15 million Canadian dollars. It stuck in the back of his mind when he took his first yoga lesson in 1997. But it jumped to the front of his mind months later in 1997 when he realized his yoga buddies were attired in an unnamed brand's dance clothes that became uncomfortably sheer and shiny when stretched, especially on anyone who wasn't as thin as a rake. The Chaturanga lovers were displeased with the dance clothes, and as a result, he discovered a gap in the market that Lupron could fill. Quote, transparency was the first issue that I wanted to solve. I believe that if I solved the transparency problem, addressed camel toe, and thickened the fabric to mask any imperfections, I could create a perfect athletic garment for women. If I could get a technical fabric that felt like cotton instead of plastic, and add properties to make it moisture-wicking and anti-stink, I could create the perfect pant. Nothing like this existed in the world. So he had his fabric, shortly thereafter renamed to Luon, but he didn't have a brand name yet. Now, this comes up as a controversy later, but I'll relay it to you now how I believe Wilson means it, as is clarified in his books. So, during his time at West Beach, a major market for commerce was Japan, and he realized how much money was to be made from expansion into the East for any company. He also simultaneously noticed how anything with the letter L would read as authentically American and therefore be able to charge a premium for the added perceived value. He therefore vowed that when starting any new company, he would purposefully add a lot of L's to give the brand prestige right from the gate. This is a legitimate strategy in Asia. I know you guys know that I speak Korean, which I do realize is not the same as Japanese, but it's similar in the way that America and Canada are similar. And we've discussed this exact tactic used in Korea in many different videos. Matan Kim, Forever 21, and even over on Underskin with my very recent Olive Young video, which you absolutely should watch after this. It's a really good one. This, as I said, is a legitimate tactic in Asia, so I do genuinely believe that he meant it like this. But we will be coming back to it later because I'm not going to defend what he says later. Though you should also know that throughout 1998, they also went through market research like roundtabling to perfect the name and the logo at this stage in Canada, and it also resonated well with the Canadian audience, so it wasn't solely based in service of the Japanese. All right, so he had capital, a hero product, a gap in the market, an original name and logo that could be trademarked, but he didn't yet have logistics routes to reach customers, and one thing he knew for sure: he did not like wholesale. Instead, he turned to D2C commerce, selling directly to the customer. It would be harder to get out of the gate or to meet new customers, but the margins he could claim would be wider. He also ensured local manufacturing, decided on a pricing strategy to undervalue his items based on traditional markups to encourage repurchasing and loyalty, though because he was doing D2C and his personal markup was 51.7%, which was much higher than the wholesale markup at the time at 37.7%, but lower than the approximately 175 to 200% markup from production to retail customers that usually pay. It was a win-win, more money for him and a lower price for better quality for customers. Wow, I wrote that. I hope you followed that. Oh my goodness, that's much more complicated than I usually explain things here. I'm just going to move on and hope the editing takes some of the heat for that, because that was dense. I'm very sorry. They niched down very specifically on a target market, who he named the Supergirls, decided on a philosophy for the company based on a training program called Landmark Forum. They found a location for the store, and he found designers to work on the final product with him, zesting out the pips so their hero product was perfect. Of course, I'm skipping over all of these quite quickly to get everything in, but each and every one of these logistical tactics is paramount to their success. And they pretty much will all be coming back throughout the video as well, starting with their location choice in March 1999. Their first store was located on West 4th Avenue, Kitsilano, Vancouver, and surprisingly didn't really have much Lululemon product at all. Just 2 yoga pants, 1 pair of shorts, and 3 tops, which were just American Apparel t-shirts printed with reflective graphics. Fun fact though, their first yoga pant was called the Boogie Pant, which evolved over time into the Groove Pant, which according to my partner Particles data, has a descendant that's still their 9th best-selling product over the past year as of April 2026. If that gives you any indication of just how beloved or how perfect this first product was. However, despite how perfect the Boogie Pant was, Lululemon Athletica really needed to be a multi-brand concept retailer at formation because their competitors like Champion, Adidas, Fila, Gaia, Calvin Klein Underwear, Cannondale, and some of the dancewear that his former yoga buddies had worn provided to be like an anchor brand to get people into the store, where their educators, read staff, could demonstrate the benefit of the brand and upsell them on their more complementary yoga gear. This, in fact, was the first part of a 3-pronged plan to add value to Lululemon from this point. Quote, determined that his employees should be sophisticated retail educators, Wilson resolved from the outset to pay them more than staff clerks usually make, as much as 30% over the local rate. Higher wages would mean less turnover, and Wilson wanted to unlock the potential of his employees. Overpaying his staff ensured that they were well-trained, recognizable to repeat customers, unlikely to leave, happy to understand and explain the value-added elements of Lululemon, like the external seaming, the reflective logo, which is good for safety, and the V-shaped pattern cutting on the waist as to be more flattering. All of those things. And importantly, it encouraged a loyalty within an encouraged community, which is exactly his second tactic, in fact, community. He began hosting these yoga sessions in the retail space, which were led by his previous yoga instructor, Fiona Stang, who also happened to be the only yoga teacher in town that was still cursed with an inadequately small yoga space in her previous gym. So inviting her just solved her problems, solved her students' problems, encouraged word-of-mouth marketing scheme that's very hard to instigate naturally, encouraged impulse purchasing from the guests, established authority within the Vancouverite yoga fandom. There were so many benefits to this. They even purposely had space during retail hours where people could just hang out to further encourage that sense of genuine community, which then, of course, naturally fed back into the design because people could directly inform on how they wanted the product to look, small changes in seams, that sort of thing, which could be actioned because they had their manufacturing there. And then the third part of this prong was advertising. Now, Lululemon likes to pretend that they don't spend on advertising. This is not true. From the beginning, they've had adverts and they spend money on traditional advertising too, but at least they do curate them in a particularly smart/targeted way. Quote, Yoga Journal magazine was a mediocre publication wallowing in the depths of the granola world. But I thought if I could be the top advertiser and control the first few pages, then I could set Lululemon up to be the international leader in yoga. I didn't want to advertise what the brand was. I wanted to advertise what the brand was not. we wanted to be clear about who our nemesis was, who we were fighting. Lululemon was against big pharma pushing unneeded drugs, unhealthy food companies, and anything that would shorten a person's life. This they communicated with a series of adverts that mocked current fitness brands or humorous moments in sports retailing, poking fun, showing that they were going about it in a new and refreshing way. He then trusted his target market of supergirls to have that same sense of humor. And boy, oh boy, did they. Quote, "By the summer of 1999, women were wearing Lululemon as they shopped, walked their dogs, or sat in cafes with their friends. Lululemon wasn't just in yoga studios, it was on the street." In these elementary phases, in this very local setting, Lululemon was sprouting. That's a lemon tree pun if you didn't catch that. I don't know if these are successful, by the way. Please feel free to cast votes on the likes and dislikes button below. Also subscribe. Thank you. But regardless of if you think I'm hysterical or simply slightly less hysterical, seeing the Lulu on the cold, mean streets of Vancouver encouraged Wilson to expand. But expansion would cost money. To resolve this, firstly he reached out to local sports clubs to carry the product, which I assume went mediocrely as he doesn't mention the results. And secondly, he considered taking on a partner in Dave Halliwell, who was a specialist in wholesale, selling a part of the business for a cash injection. But Dave was skeptical and left Wilson unsure of whether he would or would not take up the offer, though he did come to help the business while he made up his mind. However, it was at that exact point that his aforementioned limited snowboarding company, West Beach Snowboard Limited, which sold limited snowboarding goods under the West Beach Snowboard Limited brand, was sold once more from the Japanese owners to a now American company named Windcrest Partners, and they asked Chip to become their new CEO. It was this that allowed Chip to earn a nice wage and just funnel that money back into Lululemon to provide them with the cash that they needed to expand without him having to sell a stake or remortgage his house again. New designers, new educators, new logistics people all came on board slowly but surely in Chip's absence. It encouraged this spirit of autonomy at Lululemon, which would seep into every part of the company, including into their plan for a second store. You see, Chip had purposefully hired people that he trusted. He paid them well to entice the best of the best and encouraged a loyalty which he was now seeing fruits of on those on-paper risky decisions. Risky because paying people so highly goes against the norms of retail, because wages are one of the biggest variable costs in a company, so most want to get that as low as possible to make their profits as high as possible. This is why evil companies like lobby the government to keep minimum wages low. Nevertheless, Lulu were seeing the zesty fruits of their labor quickly with signing a deal in the same year, 1999, with Superstar Sports to wholesale Lululemon across Canada in their 30 stores, atop of other smaller contracts directly with yoga studios. A $30,000 Canadian cash injection into the business that would pay for their evolution into their second store. Unfortunately, however, before they could get paid from Superstar Sports, they essenced. By which I mean they declared bankruptcy and refused to pay the outstanding $30,000 Canadian that they owed to Lululemon. It halted their store plans indefinitely. That was at least until Chip took out an equity loan on his home, which is what in reality funded their second store opening in November 2000 to a ground floor spot just across the street. At which time, Lululemon, the single brand D2C retailer, was born with a pledge to sell just the one brand. Nike. No, just kidding. Adidas. Unfortunately, at this time, Chip was let go of his CEO role at West Beach too, which meant that he just didn't have the spare cash personally to invest in Lulu anymore, meaning this second store was sink or swim. But the sun shone brightly on their salutations because immediately on opening, sales peaked. The Christmas season was also upon them, their ads were hitting just right in the local community, and then the New Year's season of 2001 equally had people vowing to be back in the gym, continuing high sales into the new year. Also, having had Lululemon work autonomously in his absence allowed the company to only benefit from his return, as he allowed the de facto CEO, Sharon Gray, to continue her work unencumbered while he focused on marketing. Shannon Gray. I got her name wrong. I'm sorry, it's Shannon Gray. Unfortunately, however, Dave Halliwell, who'd brokered the failed Superstar Sports deal, said that he wouldn't stay past this time, and they parted on good terms. It ended their tentative squeeze into wholesale. Wow, Shannon and wholesale. That's bad. Should I retake it? I don't know. Instead, in the spring of 2001, Wilson was approached by a chap named Sid Beder, a Canadian apparel veteran based in Toronto, to open their first franchise store. Wilson took the deal, but he didn't have a lawyer check the contract, so foolishly accepted $25,000 for the rights to sell Lululemon in Canada's biggest city. This undervalued the brand quite enormously, but at least it would expand their reach, making them look valuable as it was in the hands of someone he trusted with ample experience. Perfect for Wilson's hands-off approach, as it allowed Beder full control of things like inventory, decoration, location, basically everything. The only thing that Wilson insisted upon to Beder and future store owners was having training at Landmark Forum to ensure consistency in their educators. It was a difference of push and pull marketing. Basically, they wanted to pull people in with informed, genuine advice, encouraging them to buy, not push product onto them by just telling them that they're pretty. That year, they had 4 million Canadian dollars in annual sales. One more thing worth pointing out though before we move on is that Beder's store was also the foundation of one more tactic that is still used by Lululemon today, and that's their seeding initiative. So normally, 6 months to 2 years before a Lulu store is established, they'll host things like pop-ups and events in the area to gauge interest and ready the market. Beder did this by turning his loft into an invite-only store and targeting Toronto's yoga studios for try-on sessions. It targeted their super girls directly and was a damn clever tactic for a young brand to experiment with locations without commitment. Beder personally took 8 months to open his store on Queen Street West, and it was a smash success immediately because of all this planning. Simultaneously, however, they also had their first scandal. It was very small in this pre-internet as we know it era, but it's worth pointing out because it was a fabric quality failure scandal. Namely, in 2002, they had to recall 2,000 pairs of yoga pants because the fabric pilled. They very much owned it, they replaced every pair possible, and nothing much came out of the scandal, probably because their customers were still very local, knew the team personally, and all that trust was very well pre-built. Plus, they also turned the fuzzy fabric into dog clothes, which sold extremely well, and ended up giving them the idea for another bestseller called their dog walking pants, as they wick dog hair incredibly efficiently, though they are no longer on their bestseller list according to the data particle derived from online sources. So, for the time being, with their first scandal, they very much turned lemons into lemonade. So from here, now the brand had struck gold with their franchising model, and with the help of a lawyer this time, they had opened another franchise in Calgary in late 2002, then Victoria, then another store in Vancouver, which had the famous launch strategy of telling the first 20 people to arrive totally naked that they would score free clothes, becoming a huge success at getting people interested and providing copious free news because it was such a hilarious idea. In fact, by January 2003, they were slated to be opening 10 Lululemon stores across America and 5 more stores to become a total of 10 in Canada, all without any insider investment. This is very rare. They'd also vertically integrated by buying a stake, maybe even the whole company, it's not very clear, in their original manufacturers in Canada who are now friends of Wilson's, diversifying their income streams, lowering costs, and ensuring that any local competitor would only be paying into their own pockets anyway. They did shut down their second store/first franchise around this time, however, that one in Toronto that I just told you about, because as Chip says in both his books, the franchisee Sid Beder wasn't following the training protocol. For example, he was telling customers that they looked pretty, which went against their spirit of internal empowerment over external validation that Lululemon had been founded on. In the end, though, because the contract had been written without a lawyer, they had to pay Beder 2.5 million Canadian dollars to buy him out, which Wilson only could achieve because he remortgaged his house again. It was another on-paper negative move in the pursuit of the greater good. Yes, that's a lemon zest pun because you get lemon zest from a grater. I hope you're enjoying these. I really enjoy them. Nevertheless, more stores followed. Briar Hill in Toronto, Santa Monica in the US as a flagship, somewhere a store called Whistler, Newport Beach, Cow Hollow, San Francisco, their first Australian store on Chapel Street in Melbourne, and I'm sure many, many, many more by the end of 2004. All of which run autonomously how the owners saw fit, as long as they were within the realm of the landmark forum training that was, which was still mandatory for nearly all the employees. Quote, "We set up the store business model to take advantage of the highly educated, well-developed employees we were attracting. Each store manager was an entrepreneur, and we paid them accordingly. We set managers, all women, full company financials until 2006. We helped them become financially literate so they could make their own decisions as we were totally decentralized. Our managers had complete control of their windows, hiring and training, etc. We knew if we didn't give them almost total control, we wouldn't be able to keep the intelligent minds active and they would get bored and quit. This model proved so profitable that we could pay a manager 2 to 3 times what other retailers could. We completely upset the low-cost wholesale retail model. The part of the business model was critical because we had to educate customers on what they could not see visually. We needed extraordinary educators to deliver our message and to connect on the same educational level as our guests. Their stores were so successful, in fact, that they were unusually profitable within months of launching, which is a real anomaly in retail where it takes at least a year for companies just to break even normally. They were clearly onto something from a product-first standpoint, even if there were a few more bumps in the road. Namely, firstly, the fact that they just didn't get on social media early enough, which he does admit in his books was a huge mistake. And secondly, the backlash following an interview at the end of 2004. And this one you probably know. This was the interview in which, when discussing how the name Lululemon was geared towards a Japanese audience, Chip said, and I quote, "It's funny to watch them try and say it. Something very obviously racist as a bite." It was also totally unintentional because what he meant to say was that if they expanded into Asia, they would have an American feel to the name built in, which, to be clear, he did clarify in the interview, but because the aforementioned quote mocking the Japanese was far more clickable, it was the one more widely reported. And I'm not defending what he's saying here. He made a throwaway comment that was racist. But you will notice from this point, it becomes a very consistent theme that Chip is an awful public speaker, really terrible. I mean, floundering, he comes across as doltish despite knowing very well what he is talking about. There are multiple speeches and interviews online, and almost none of them are actively good. He absolutely should have taken the time at this point, if not before, to invest in media training for himself because it hurts the company endlessly from this point onwards as he evolves into the brand's biggest point of weakness. He even got into another scandal mere months after this in January 2005 when he supposedly endorsed child labor at the Business Alliance of Local Living Economies conference in Vancouver. Here is exactly what he said on screen, and here is what he supposedly meant, defended by somebody who was literally there. The company even had to release this picture to kind of prove that they weren't using child labor themselves. In fact, he was so bad at public speaking that nearly all of his speeches on YouTube have awful comments under them because of exactly that. Here's just a few from his Google Tech Talk speech in 2008, which I believe is the earliest speech on record, or at least the earliest speech with a comment section to read. So I am not defending this guy. What he said was racist and really strange, but it's very important to the story that you know that Chip is an awful, awful verbal communicator. Okay, so let's go back to the timeline. And in late 2004, early 2005, they just turned down an offer for a full buyout from Victoria's Secret. They also expanded into Japan in spring 2005 with a subsidiary franchise performing mediocrely. And in the summer of that year, they also began to scout for a venture capital firm to help them scale. They had many offers, of course, but eventually they went with a company called Advent International and a second company called Highland Capital Partners, both of whom venture capitalists, on the provision that they hire Tom Stenberg, the founder of Staples, as a board member. Wilson and Stenberg got on pretty well. The heads of Adventure International completed their landmark forum training very well, so to him it was a no-brainer. Lululemon sold 48%, half to each VC firm, for a total of $108 million, valuing the company at $225 million. By this point, they had 33 stores in Canada, and I have no idea how many in the US, Japan, and Australia. They brought on Robert Mears, a former Reebok exec, as CEO beginning January 2006, who you would think would take over the public speaking from Wilson, but he didn't. More stores followed, including their flagship in New York. They changed franchising contracts in Japan to go with Descent, who are a much larger firm. They sold their stake in the Canadian manufacturers as it was a distraction, according to the board. Began on setting up an online store that would only really launch in 2009 because of the recession. And the news was broken to Wilson that they wanted to take Lululemon to an IPO, effective immediately. Now, this was a shock. In the lead up to the sale, and one of the reasons that he went with these two VC companies was that he was told that it would be about 5 to 7 years needed in growth before an IPO plan was audited. But now, just months after the sale, they wanted to go public. It was a sign that he'd chosen the wrong venture capitalists. They just didn't care for the longevity of the business in the same way that he did. So this is why they sold the manufacturing company to remove Lululemon's vertical integration. This is why they signed with Descent. This is why they opened so many stores in quick succession, neglecting the pre-launch testing for locations. This is why his sister-in-law had been asked to step down from the board almost immediately after it was set up. They'd even had Wilson change his lawyer. These were all small increments that he just didn't realize would be a sign of a bigger issue at the time, but they were. In fact, he just wouldn't become suspicious at all until after their premature launch on the New York Stock Exchange in 2007, when he overheard an argument on a plane involving the CEO, Robert Mears, and David Musafa, who's the managing partner at Advent International, in which Robert was yelling that over the past year, he'd grown the company so quickly that it reached such a successful stock price on the market for a consistent 2 months, making them all rich. He didn't realize it at the time, but slowly, Wilson began to realize that not only had David had a secret deal with Robert, that all the decisions made up to their launch on the stock exchange and afterwards only fed short-term goals, not in the pursuit of longevity, nor in the best interest of their customer or their product. None of it. And here's the big problem. Venture capital benefit from short-term impacts on their stock price more impactfully. They are simply not concerned with the long-term health of the company as long as their shareholders become rich. Quote, in February 2008, MarketWatch summarized the situation like this. All Mears had to do was to be on the job when Lululemon's Lulu plus 0.04% share price hit a certain level and its private equity investors sold a slug of shares. This puts management's interests in line with private equity, not necessarily with public shareholders. The same analysis described the inherent dangers of these kinds of deals because they align management's interests with the wrong group of shareholders, those who are cashing out. I realized that Bob had done everything in his power to get the share value to where it needed to be to trigger his exit, and that he was likely incentivized to maximize that share price. The easiest way for him to do this was to open new stores carelessly. I realized then that it had never been Bob's intention to set Lululemon on a course to sustained long-term growth. He was incentivized for short-term results. Also to private equity's benefit because they both maximized their share value and cashed out. Robert stopped showing up to work soon after the argument, and in early 2008, though actually before Robert's departure was officially announced, they got a new CEO named Christine Day. Now, Christine actually was/is a phenomenal public speaker, which is evidenced almost immediately when their line Vita C, which launched in 2006 and boasted a seaweed-based tech fiber called C-Cell, came under fire because Wilson told a journalist that they hadn't done any technical testing, which is just so stupid. C-Cell is a real thing. It still exists today, and though Lululemon was hyperbolic in their promotional activities, we can admit that, it actually is an incredible fiber. But then it got worse after an unnamed person who was shorting the Lululemon stock, which means he was selling his stock betting the price would go down so that he could buy it back when it was a low value and pocket the difference, i.e. he was not looking for long-term growth in the company, just short-term quick cash, paid the New York Times to do their own independent test, which of course said that C-Cell didn't do the things that it claimed in a very obviously biased survey. Again, not defending Chip, but wow. Imagine being so bad at public speaking that people who are trying to vulture money off of your company can just bet on you being a terrible public speaker so they can make more money from your mistakes. And it worked. Incredible. Hi, so Underspouse said that was too dense. So in the simplest terms, I'm literally going to just use a metaphor. So you sell a Beanie Baby to your friend for $10 and you tell that friend afterwards, ew. So that friend then sells that Beanie Baby back to you for $5 and you've effectively made $5 in profit. And you can also claim it on taxes, but let's not get into that. That's even more confusing. From here on, as a result, Christine takes over pretty much all of the public speaking and soon gets credited with all of the many different differentiators of Lululemon. She gets credited with paying staff more, the landmark forum training, shop autonomy, preemptive marketing, some of the design elements even, locations for new stores, basically everything. It was very clear from this point that they began erasing Chip from the company. He was just too risky. Actually, I have an old acquaintance who's high up in the Lululemon sphere, and I was just chatting to them casually about the business, knowing full well the sponsor of this is the data analytical tool Particle, so I could speak to them a bit more candidly without having to worry about having them involved. And even today, Chip is still not looked upon too fondly by the company. And honestly, I get why, because from here, he is their biggest point of weakness when looking at it from a shareholder perspective. Of course, Lululemon still had their DNA, so they still had their tongue-in-cheek adverts. These ones are my favorites from their website launch in 2009. They still had their community building days with yoga in the studio. They still had sponsored events outside. They still trained at Landmark Forum. So everything outwardly for consumers was great and normal, especially considering the company on paper was growing, including having more stores in more countries and the launch of their diffusion line Eviva, which was intended for 12 to 14-year-olds. But then came more prob-lemons. Firstly, Wilson's racism accusation from 2004 just kept coming up. They then began being accused of being a cult in the media. In December 2009, they removed their size 14 clothes, causing a lot of sizist accusations. They got into some tongue-in-cheek hot water when they made unofficial Olympics merch named Global Sporting Event that takes place in British Columbia between 2009 and 2011 edition, which I personally think is hysterical, but it did cause a mini scandal nonetheless. Multiple new direct competitors started popping up when brands like Gap launched Athleta, which I know isn't a scandal, but it's going here nonetheless. They had a scandal based on their scarcity tactic, i.e. people complained so much that they felt coerced to buy full price because Lulu never had enough stock to go on sale, that their shares fell 6% in value in March 2011. Also in March 2011, Jana Murray was murdered inside the store by her co-worker who she caught stealing, which honestly I think is more likely for the reason that the 6% share value fell because it happened in the same month, but it's absolutely never framed that way. And then in March 2013, they had their biggest scandal to date, when there was, again, an unacceptable level of sheerness in their products. This was the problem that Lululemon had literally been set up to resolve, and it was back. It really wedged trust in the brand, sliced their community, juiced and zested their loyal fans for money. Chip in his book roots this all the way back to early 2010 when, quote, Christine was adding value to Lululemon stock by trimming expenses and testing the upper limits of what we could charge for our product. I believe this created bad profit. It exposed on a more public level that their goods were no longer made in Canada, which they hadn't been for years in reality. The faith that people had in Lululemon for the quality of their clothes, both to suck them in and to not reveal their Victoria's Secret, had been tarnished. By June, Christine had announced her resignation. A shame, really, because Chip had many flaws as a leader and she ironed them out pretty well. If they'd worked together and she didn't take a lot of the credit for his work, and or if he was just okay with her taking the credit or the limelight, then they would have been a match made in heaven. I say this specifically because literally within only months, the relationship between Chip and the board deteriorated after he put a quote from right-wing author Ayn Rand on his bags. He said he didn't think her personal beliefs had anything to do with the quote that he was using, but that's stupid. Of course it does. Patronage is still patronage, especially if you're spreading it to other people. You don't have to buy to be a consumer. Very important to remember that. It was just another example of him not being the best public speaker or communicator of his ideas, but this time it came at a time when the company was already quite down. Wilson was just proving to be major liability yet again to the people that wanted their Lululemonade, and it doesn't even end there, because by November the same year, Chip would make another comment that I don't think Christine would have blundered, when he said, Lululemons don't work for some women's bodies. I mean, trying to communicate that people wear their yoga pants purposefully 3 times smaller to imitate compression pants, or wearing them in ways that would compromise the fabric, such as with a belt. Instead, he just communicated that he blamed the customers' bodies for the faults of the product, and without proper explanation, seemed to insult his customers by saying that, for example, if your thighs rub together, that Lululemons don't work for you. He made a now deleted apology for his comments, and Lululemon stock hit an all-time low when the apology video was called the worst apology in history. While he was right that short-term profit-led decisions in quality and quick expansion would hurt them in the long term, he just also couldn't see that these stupid quotes in the media about the Japanese, Ayn Rand, child labor, or that the pill was to blame for divorce would have an equally detrimental effect. It was time for Chip to leave. He was removed as chairman of the board in December and shortly after left the company for the last time, selling half of his stock to Advent International in August 2014 for $845 million, leaving him with about 3 to 8.5% remaining and gaining Advent 2 seats on the board in the process, something which he hoped would steer the company into making long-term decisions once again. But it didn't. Laurent Potvin had taken the role of CEO, and he'd become the first CEO to not undertake the landmark forum training. It marked a huge shift for the company to be obviously in service to the shareholders, something that Chip blamed on the fact that they had not trained a successor to Christine, leaving them with someone external to run an already established community. Lululemon was not in a good place, and yet expansions were plentiful, with expansions into swimwear, into office-friendly cycling clothes, menswear. For some reason, there was a lager. More stores exploded. Expansions into England in 2015, into France in September 2015. 20 stores were planned for mainland Europe within the next 2 years from there. And yet the share prices just stagnated. The board wasn't too happy. Add to that the fact that Potvin created a toxic work environment and that he was having an inappropriate intra-office relationship with one of the designers, causing her to quit in 2014, but not him, a problem that the board knew could hurt them at the height of the Me Too movement. He wasn't a particularly well-liked CEO. In fact, the board was unhappy with Potvin for a very long time as a result of all of this, but only managed to finally get him to step down in 2018 when he was replaced by Calvin McDonald, the former CEO of Sephora. And still things didn't really pick up. So McDonald was the CEO throughout all of this time. You can see on my sponsor particles data. And you can see here that while sales are high, they're stagnated. Over the course of 4 years that Particle has documented data on, we can see that the only spikes in sales are during the Christmas season, and the dips between just don't increase whatsoever over time, which for a company that is based on drops of scarce inventories releases is not a great sign. Of course, this is literally billions of dollars in sales, so on paper, the sales look fine, but stagnant sales don't increase share price, which is their main goal at this point. There are positives, however, because as from Particle's data, we can see their product diversification has now proved to be very successful because their top products are nicely varied. They're not too reliant on the potentially sheer yoga pants anymore, though it is still their hero product, so it has a nice stable foundation for them, and the other bits just build on that world very well. Especially because, by and large, this period was without any major scandal. At least until 2024. This is when their breeze-through yoga pants, designed to be worn in a hot yoga studio, were unflattering and sheer, another hit to their low product quality claims. So despite it being a decent year for sales according to Particle's data, or at least better than the years preceding it, throughout 2025, their stock price fell a reported 50% for not one specific reason, which means that consumers had just lost trust in Lulu and were going to other brands. It was clear McDonald's leadership just could not revive the brand in the way that they needed. So then, when activist investor Elliott Investment Management came in with a $1 billion stake in December 2025, and they proposed a new CEO named Jane Nielsen, it was clear that McDonald's no longer had the farm. EI, oh no. He announced his departure in December thereafter, shortly before Chip stuck his head into the mix once again by waging a proxy battle to remake the board, accusing them of failure of board oversight due to them losing their product-first mindset, which damaged Lululemon's perceived value. And at least in this, I think we can all agree that he is right. He's nominated several people for a new board, and though we don't concretely know if he will be successful with exactly what he wants, it will be a new board who would then be tasked with naming a new CEO, effectively cutting Jane Nielsen from the mix, though she's not entirely off the plate. And this is basically where Lululemon is today. They have two temporary CEOs, their CFO Megan Frank and COO Andre Mastrini, who are helming the mercurial company, with Frank seemingly being the favorite to take over if WWD is correct. Though everyone and their mother seems to be weighing in on what they're going to do, with lots of different opinions. To condense all the options I read online to one succinct list, experts seem to suggest them to scale back the business, close the stores that are unnecessary, return to a scarcity mindset to become purposeful in sales, find better fabric mills or invest in higher quality fabrics, return the hyper-focus on meticulous quality that the company was founded with, return to solving modern workout issues for women. And I agree with all of these, frankly, but I don't think the board will. In order to achieve all of these things, they need to go through a period where the company willingly makes short-term losses to return authority within their niche. Less points of sale and a more expensive production cost is just the polar opposite of what a publicly traded company would want, because a publicly traded company's first priority is not their customers, it's their investors. And investors will simply never unanimously agree on what is best for the company in the long term, because they need short-term gains for their own pocket. Remember the guy that sold the story on C-cell fabric just to make a quick buck a couple years ago? That's basically what we're dealing with here. So instead, before any of the things that these experts suggest, I personally think they need to re-privatize. It's a huge task, but I think as long as he can secure financing and buy back shares, Chip is just nutty enough to actually do something like this, in my opinion. I guess it's obvious what Lululemon needs in that respect, but I just don't think their investors will allow it to happen. It's too radical, and they're far too happy chewing on their nose to realize that they're spiting their face. I'll leave you with a quote from Chip's open letter to the board that he released a couple months back when he came in with this proxy battle, when he suggested they need to catalyze a quantum of change that is sorely needed. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe for more videos like this, and check out my beauty channel Underskin for videos like this but about beauty brands. A special thank you, of course, goes out to my lovely patrons and YouTube channel members for your ongoing support. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.